the quiet expanse of Arizona's sun-baked grasslands, Rick, a seasoned wildlife photographer known for his patience and solitude, waited silently for the perfect shot. Day after day, he lies in wait, a ghost in the grasslands, invisible to the world. But the desert has a surprise for him. Not the venomous lizard he seeks, but a tiny, fearless bobcat kitten who decides this strange, camouflaged man is no threat. Rick didn't move. He just slowly reached into his backpack and pulled out a bit of jerky, his lunch. The kitten sniffed it, gave a cute sneeze, then took it in its mouth like a trophy and scampered off. But when Rick returned the next day, something was waiting for him. Not just one kitten, but an entire brigade of wild bobcat siblings. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Of all the qualities a man might possess, patience was the one Rick prided himself on most. At 62, with a face weathered by sun and wind into a roadmap of laugh lines and concentration furrows, he figured he'd earned it. For 40 years, he'd been a nature photographer, a profession that was less about snapping pictures and more about the art of becoming invisible. He'd waited for weeks in the freezing Alaskan tundra for a glimpse of a spirit bear, sat motionless for days in a humid Florida swamp to capture the iridescent gleam of a roseate spoonbill, and now he was practicing his art of stillness in the dry, baking heat of the Arizona grasslands. His current quest was for a shot of a Gila monster. The venomous, beaded lizard was a creature of mythic patience itself, and Rick respected that. It was a duel of endurance. For a week, he'd been rising before the sun, driving his dusty pickup truck to the edge of a vast, sun-bleached expanse, and trekking to a spot he'd chosen for its perfect morning light. He'd then lie on his stomach, a camouflage tarp draped over him, his long lens looking like a natural extension of the arid earth, and wait. The world through his lens was a silent, slow-motion ballet. A roadrunner zipped past, a blur of brown and attitude. A hawk circled high overhead, a dark comma against the brilliant blue sky. The heat shimmered off the red sand, making the distant saguaro cacti dance. It was a beautiful, lonely existence, and lately, Rick had been feeling the lonely part more than the beautiful one. His wife, Clara, had passed away 2 years prior, and the quiet of the wilderness that had once been a source of peace now often echoed the quiet in his heart. He was just beginning to feel the familiar midday drowsiness, the sun beating a gentle rhythm on his back, when a flicker of movement caught his eye. It wasn't the slow, deliberate crawl of a Gila monster. This was small, jerky, and radiating an absurd amount of confidence. He slowly, carefully, swiveled his head. There, waddling out from behind a clump of brittle bush, was a bobcat kitten. It was no bigger than a loaf of sourdough bread, with paws that seemed comically oversized for its tiny body. Its fur was a masterpiece of desert camouflage, spotted and striped, but its demeanor was anything but hidden. It marched directly toward him, its tail a stubby, twitching exclamation point. Rick froze, his breath caught in his chest. This was a gift, a moment of pure, unscripted magic. He forgot all about the Gila monster. He watched as the kitten, with the swagger of a seasoned gunslinger entering a saloon, stopped a few feet from his head. It tilted its little face, its ears like tiny radar dishes, and looked him straight in the eye. A normal person might have been startled. A wildlife expert might have been concerned about the mother's whereabouts. Rick was simply, utterly charmed. The kitten let out a soft, questioning mew, a sound so delicate it seemed to get lost in the vastness of the landscape. Without thinking, driven by a grandfatherly impulse he hadn't felt in years, Rick moved with painstaking slowness. He eased his hand back toward his backpack, which lay beside him. The kitten watched his every move, its blue eyes wide with curiosity, not fear. He unzipped a side pocket and retrieved his lunch, a piece of beef jerky. It was tough, salty, and probably not on any approved Bobcat kitten diet plan, but it was all he had. He held it out. The kitten took a cautious step forward, its nose twitching furiously. It sniffed the air, then the tip of the jerky. Its tiny nostrils flared, and it let out an adorable, explosive sneeze that sent a puff of red dust into the air. Rick stifled a chuckle. The kitten, undeterred, opened its mouth, revealing a set of needle-sharp baby teeth, and gently took the jerky from his fingers. It was a surprisingly delicate transaction. Trophy secured, the kitten turned and scampered back the way it came, its prize held high. Rick watched it disappear behind the brittle bush, a tiny bandit making off with the loot. "Well, I'll be," he whispered to the empty space. "I'll call you Bandit." He chuckled to himself, a warm, rumbling sound that felt good in his chest. He felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in a long time. The loneliness had receded, replaced by the warmth of the small, absurd encounter. He packed up his gear for the day, the Gila monster completely forgotten. The perfect shot could wait. The next morning, Rick returned to his spot with a renewed sense of purpose. He told himself he was there for the lizard, but his eyes kept scanning the brittle bush. He'd brought his usual lunch, but he'd also packed a few extra, smaller pieces of jerky, just in case. He felt a bit foolish, like a teenager waiting for a crush to walk by, but he couldn't help it. He settled into his usual position, the familiar weight of the camera a comfort. An hour passed, then another. The sun climbed higher, and the desert settled into its midday hush. Rick sighed. It had been a one-time thing, a fluke, a little gift from the wilderness that wouldn't be repeated. Then he heard it. Not the scuttling of a lizard or the whisper of the wind. It was a soft, pattering sound, the sound of many, many tiny paws. He turned his head slowly, his heart giving a surprising leap. His jaw went slack. There, emerging from behind the same brittle bush, was Bandit. And he wasn't alone. He was leading a veritable parade of fuzz. Tumbling, wrestling, and pouncing on each other was a chaotic avalanche of 4 more Bobcat kittens, identical in their spotted splendor, but each with a spark of unique personality already shining through. Bandit trotted at their head, looking immensely proud of himself, as if he were presenting his ragtag army to a commanding officer. Rick was so stunned he forgot to breathe. The kittens, emboldened by their leader, showed none of Bandit's initial caution. They treated the 6'2" camouflaged human as a newly discovered and fascinating piece of landscape. One, a particularly fluffy and slightly clumsy-looking kitten, waddled straight to Rick's worn leather boot and began trying to climb it, its tiny claws making soft scratching sounds. Another, a sleek female with a perpetually unimpressed expression, spotted the lens cap dangling from his camera. She crouched, wiggled her hindquarters, and batted it with a professional boxer's precision. A third, the smallest of the group, scrambled right up his back, navigated the terrain of his shoulder blade, and slapped him gently on the cheek with a soft paw, its expression clearly asking, "All right, pal, where's the grub?" The fourth was a blur of motion, a tiny, hyperactive dervish that chased its own tail, then a grasshopper, then zipped in frantic circles around the bemused Rick. Rick didn't know what to do. He was trapped, pinned down by a Lilliputian army of predators. But fear was the furthest thing from his mind. A laugh started deep in his belly, a genuine rolling laugh that shook his whole body. He laughed until tears streamed down his weathered cheeks and his sides ached. This was the most unprofessional, most ridiculous, most wonderful thing that had ever happened to him. He was no longer Rick, the stoic nature photographer. He was Uncle Rick, the Bobcat babysitter. He carefully reached for the jerky he'd prepared. As he opened the bag, 5 little heads snapped to attention, their ears swiveling in unison. He tossed out the pieces, and a comical free-for-all ensued. The clumsy one, who he immediately named Biscuit, managed to trip over his own feet and land face first in the sand, coming up with a dusty nose and a look of profound bewilderment. The sassy female, Claudia, deftly snatched a piece from her brother and retreated to a safe distance to enjoy her spoils. The hyperactive one, Turbo, grabbed his piece and immediately lost it while chasing a butterfly. Bandit, the seasoned pro, ate his with quiet dignity. As the kittens munched and wrestled, Rick noticed another presence. Sitting regally on a sun-warmed rock about 20 yards away was their mother. She was magnificent, a full-grown bobcat with powerful muscles, a thick ruff of fur, and intelligent amber eyes that watched him with an unnerving intensity. She wasn't threatening. She was observing, evaluating. She seemed to have concluded that this strange, lumpy, jerky-dispensing creature was not a danger to her brood. In fact, he seemed to be a rather effective distraction. Rick gave her a slow, respectful nod. "Queenie," he murmured under his breath. It seemed to fit her majestic, slightly aloof demeanor. The days that followed fell into a new, absurd rhythm. Rick would arrive, set up his gear, and wait for his clients. The kittens would appear, led by Bandit, and the chaos would begin. They turned his carefully chosen photography spot into their personal playground. Biscuit discovered that Rick's camera bag was the perfect shape for a nap. Claudia developed a fascination with the zipper on his jacket, pulling it up and down with her teeth for what seemed like hours. Turbo treated Rick's outstretched legs as a racetrack, using his shins as a banked turn. Rick's photography changed. He still had his long lens, but now it was often pointed at his own feet, capturing a close-up of a kitten attacking his shoelaces. He started bringing a small video camera, setting it up on a tripod to film his own interactions with the Bobcat Brigade, as he'd started calling them. The footage was priceless. It was a documentary not of wildlife in its natural, untouched state, but of the hilarious, messy, and heartwarming intersection of two worlds. He narrated his films in a low whisper. Day 12 of the Bobcat occupation. He'd murmur into his camera's microphone. Queenie is supervising from her throne on the rock. She seems to approve of my babysitting services, though she has yet to offer payment. Biscuit has fallen asleep in the lens hood again. I fear my Gila Monster project is officially on hold due to a severe case of cuteness overload. He learned their personalities intimately. Bandit was the thoughtful leader. Claudia was the clever, independent hunter of the group, often pouncing on lizards and large insects with startling ferocity. Turbo was pure, unadulterated energy, a tiny agent of chaos. And then there was Biscuit. Sweet, clumsy, food-motivated Biscuit. He was the runt of the litter, slightly smaller and a step slower than the others. He was the one who always got his jerky stolen, the one who tripped into cactus patches, requiring a delicate and nerve-wracking rescue by Rick with a pair of tweezers. and the one who seemed to have a special bond with the strange, gentle giant who gave out snacks. Biscuit would often forgo the wrestling matches and simply curl up against Rick's side, purring a rumbling motorboat purr that vibrated right through to Rick's soul. It was during one of these quiet moments, with Biscuit snoozing on his ribs and the other kittens chasing a tumbleweed, that Rick felt a profound sense of peace. The echoing quiet in his heart had been filled with the sound of tiny purrs and playful squeaks. He wasn't lonely anymore. He had a family. A weird, wild, and completely unexpected family. The Arizona summer deepened, and the heat became a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the landscape. The daily thunderstorms that rolled in during the late afternoon became more violent. Rick knew this was a dangerous time in the desert. Flash floods could turn a dry wash into a raging river in minutes. The heat was relentless, and water was scarce. He had grown more attached to the kittens than he ever would have admitted. His professional detachment had been completely eroded. He worried about them constantly. He started bringing a large, shallow dish of water each day, which Queenie, after a day of suspicious observation, finally allowed her kittens to drink from. She seemed to understand, on some level, that he was a help, not a hindrance. Their relationship had evolved into a quiet partnership. She would hunt for their real meals, teaching them the ways of the wild, and he would provide the supplementary snacks, the playground, and the safe space. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, menacing purple. The air grew still and heavy. Rick, checking the weather on his phone earlier, knew a major storm was coming. He should have packed up and left an hour ago, but the kittens had been particularly playful, and he'd lost track of time. "All right, you little rascals, time for Uncle Rick to head home," he said, starting to gather his gear. "Show's over for today." The kittens, sensing the change in the atmosphere, were huddled close to Queenie near the rock. But Biscuit, true to form, was lagging behind. He had been chasing a particularly interesting beetle near the edge of a shallow, dry arroyo about 50 yards away. Then, the world seemed to break open. A deafening crack of thunder sounded directly overhead, and the sky unleashed a torrent. The rain wasn't just falling, it was a solid wall of water, so dense it was hard to see through. The dry, baked earth couldn't absorb it fast enough. The shallow arroyo began to fill with a muddy, churning slurry of water and debris. Rick's heart seized. "Biscuit!" he yelled, his voice swallowed by the roar of the storm. He saw the kitten, startled and scared, trying to scramble up the now slippery bank of the arroyo. But the rising water was too fast. It swirled around his paws, pulling him back. Queenie was frantic, pacing on the edge, letting out sharp, distressed cries. But she wouldn't enter the churning water. She knew it was a death trap. Rick was frozen for a second, a war raging within him. The prime directive of every wildlife documentarian screamed in his head. "Do not interfere. You are an observer, not a participant. Nature must take its course." He saw Biscuit lose his footing, a tiny speck of fur being swept away in the brown torrent. He heard Queenie's desperate cry, a sound that wasn't just an animal's instinct, but a mother's anguish. And in that moment, the rulebook went out the window. The prime directive was overwritten by a more powerful one. You protect your family. The hell with nature's course? Rick roared into the storm. He dropped his expensive camera bag, not caring that it landed in a growing puddle. He ran, his old knees protesting, his boots slipping in the slick mud. He sprinted along the bank of the arroyo, his eyes locked on the tiny, struggling form. Biscuit was being tumbled over and over, his head occasionally breaking the surface. The arroyo was getting deeper, the current stronger. Rick knew he only had one chance. Ahead, the wash narrowed, and a fallen Palo Verde tree lay partially across it, creating a bottleneck of churning water and debris. If Biscuit got swept into that, he'd be gone for good. Without hesitating, Rick slid down the muddy bank and plunged into the waist-deep water. The cold shock took his breath away, and the current was shockingly powerful, tugging at his legs. He braced himself against the flow, his eyes scanning the debris-filled water. "Biscuit, I'm coming, little guy," he yelled. He saw him, a flash of spotted fur pinned against a thick branch just before the logjam. He was barely moving. Rick pushed forward, fighting the current with every ounce of his strength. The water was a filthy, chaotic mess of sticks, leaves, and sand. He reached the branch, his fingers wrapping around the slick wood. He leaned out, stretching, his shoulders screaming in protest. His fingers brushed against the kitten's sodden fur. He managed to get a grip, a handful of scruff and loose skin. He pulled. Biscuit was limp, a dead weight. For a terrible second, Rick thought he was too late. He pulled the kitten to his chest, shielding it from the current, and began to fight his way back to the bank. It was a grueling, desperate struggle. The mud on the bank gave way twice before he finally found purchase and hauled himself and his small, precious cargo out of the water. He collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, rain and mud plastering his hair to his face. He looked down at Biscuit. The little kitten was terrifyingly still. Rick's heart plummeted. He gently laid him on the ground and, acting on pure instinct, pressed his 2 fingers against the tiny ribcage, giving a small, gentle pump. He then lowered his head and breathed a tiny puff of air into the kitten's nose and mouth. Once. Twice. On the 3rd puff, Biscuit gave a shuddering cough. Water sputtered from his mouth, and he took a weak, ragged breath. His eyes fluttered open, dazed and terrified. Rick felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made him pass out. He scooped up the trembling kitten and wrapped him inside his jacket, zipping it up to shield him from the rain and warm him with his own body heat. He looked up. The storm was already starting to pass, the rain lessening. Through the gray sheet of water, he saw Queenie. She was standing at the edge of the wash, not on her rock, but on the ground, closer than she had ever been. Her family was huddled behind her. She was looking right at him, and her expression was no longer one of wary observation. It was something else entirely, something that looked, to Rick's tired and hopeful eyes, like profound, soul-deep gratitude. She gave a soft, low chuff, a sound he'd never heard before, and then slowly, deliberately, shepherded her other kittens away into the shelter of the rocks. She trusted him to take care of this one. The drive back to his small rental cabin was a blur. Rick held the shivering bundle inside his jacket, the heater in his truck blasting on high. He talked to Biscuit the whole way, his voice low and soothing. "You gave me a scare, you little knucklehead. A real scare, but you're okay. Uncle Rick's got you." Back at the cabin, he wrapped Biscuit in a warm, dry towel and held him close. He made a weak broth from some chicken he had, letting the kitten lick it from his finger. For the next 2 days, Rick didn't go out to the grasslands. He stayed in, nursing his patient. Biscuit was weak and slept almost constantly, curled up on a pillow next to Rick's bed. Rick would wake in the night just to watch the gentle rise and fall of the tiny chest, reassuring himself that he was still there. On the 3rd morning, Rick awoke to a scratching sound. He opened his eyes to see Biscuit on the floor, batting playfully at a loose thread on the rug. He looked up at Rick and let out a surprisingly strong mew. He was going to be okay. When Rick finally returned to his spot, he was nervous. Had he broken the trust? Had he crossed a line that would change everything? He placed the now healthy Biscuit on the ground. The kitten immediately scampered over to his siblings, who greeted him with a flurry of licks and pounces. Rick looked toward Queenie's rock. She was there, watching. He gave her a nod. She held his gaze for a long moment, then blinked slowly, a sign of trust and relaxation in the feline world. A few minutes later, she disappeared into the brush and returned with a freshly caught lizard, which she deposited pointedly a few feet from Rick before retreating to her rock. It was a gift. A thank you, payment for services rendered. The seasons began to turn. The fierce heat of summer softened into the golden glow of autumn. The kittens grew, their legs lengthening, their bodies filling out. Their spots became less distinct as their adult coats came in. They were still playful, but their games now had the sharper edge of practice, of honing the skills they would need to survive. Rick documented it all. His footage was a masterpiece, but not of the kind he had ever intended to create. It was a personal story of love, trust, and the strange, unwritten rules of the wild. He had footage of Claudia's first successful rabbit hunt, of Turbo learning to leap from rock to rock with breathtaking agility, of Bandit watching over his siblings with a quiet, confident authority. And he had hours of footage of Biscuit. Biscuit, who had almost been lost, now strong and healthy. He remained the most affectionate of the bunch, and he never lost his habit of curling up by Rick's side for a nap. The day Rick had been dreading finally came. He arrived at his spot, set up his gear, and waited. And waited. The sun climbed, the shadows shortened, but the grasslands remained empty. No pattering paws, no fuzzy avalanche. He stayed until dusk, a hollow feeling growing in his chest. They were gone. Queenie had decided it was time to move on, to lead her now adolescent children to their own territories. He came back the next day, and the day after that, but the silence remained. The quiet he had once sought was now a painful reminder of what he had lost. His job there was done. It was time to pack up and go home. On his final morning, he stood by his truck, looking out over the landscape one last time. He felt a profound ache of sadness, but underneath it, a deep and abiding sense of gratitude. These animals had saved him just as surely as he had saved Biscuit. They had filled a void in his life he didn't even know was there. As the sun cast long shadows across the red earth, he saw a movement on a distant ridge. He raised his binoculars, his heart pounding. It was them. 5 sleek, powerful bobcats, moving with grace and purpose. They paused, 5 silhouettes against the setting sun. One of them, the leader, turned and looked back in his direction. Rick didn't need binoculars to know it was Bandit. He held the gaze for a long moment, a final, silent acknowledgement, before turning to follow his family into the vast, wild unknown. Rick lowered his binoculars, a slow smile spreading across his face. He got into his truck and turned the key. As he drove away, he glanced at the passenger seat where his camera bag sat. It was filled with tapes and memory cards containing the greatest story he had ever captured. It wasn't the story of the Gila monster or of some rare bird. It was the story of Uncle Rick and the Bobcat Brigade. A story not just of wildlife, but of a wild life, filled with unexpected love, heart-stopping fear, and the kind of hilarious, heartwarming chaos that can only be found when you throw out the rule book and give a little bit of your heart away. And maybe, in the wildest corners of America, and in the quietest corners of a lonely man's soul, that was the very best kind